Vladimir Putin wanted a river. Not a village, not a town, an entire river. The Dnieper. And he wanted Russian forces standing on its banks by the end of 2026. That ambition wasn't whispered in a closed-door meeting or leaked through anonymous sources. It was announced, on camera, by the Kremlin's own spokesperson, who confirmed that Russian troops pushing into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast were doing exactly that, building what Moscow called a buffer zone deep enough and wide enough to keep Ukrainian weapons permanently out of range. Russia backed that ambition with everything a state at war can throw behind a plan. Russian forces pushed their footprint in the region past 400 square kilometers. Moscow activated one of its most decorated combat divisions and rushed it south specifically to hold this ground, a unit carrying battle honors that trace all the way back to the Second World War. 13 months of planning, fortifying, and reinforcing went into turning this stretch of Ukrainian farmland into something the Kremlin considered permanent, a shield protecting Russia's own supply lines, a launching pad for whatever came next. Then, in a single night in July, almost all of it vanished. 6 villages changed hands. A defensive line that had absorbed months of Russian reinforcement simply stopped existing. And the strangest part isn't that this happened. It's that afterward, almost nobody, including Ukraine's own military spokesperson, could say exactly how long it actually took. To understand how a stronghold this heavily fortified came apart this fast, we need to go back to the exact night it happened. On the night of July 13th, soldiers broke through Russian defensive lines in the Oleksandrivka direction and advanced roughly 25 kilometers into territory Russia had spent over a year fortifying. According to the regiment's official report, 6 settlements came back under Ukrainian control in that single push. Turnov, Zaporizhzhny, Novohyorhivka, Voronezh, Siknev, and Malyivka. Altogether, the operation reclaimed roughly 126 square kilometers, land that had been under Russian occupation since the previous summer. Now here's why the shape of this assault mattered just as much as its size. According to the statement of 425th Skelia Assault Regiment, dozens of separate assault groups launched from the area of Veliko-Mikhailivka at the exact same moment, splitting into 2 directions simultaneously, one pushing east, one pushing south. That timing wasn't accidental, and it wasn't improvised on the spot either. When an army attacks along a single direction, defenders can concentrate their reserves exactly where the pressure lands hardest. But when dozens of groups move in 2 directions at once, there's no single point left to reinforce. Every direction becomes the main threat simultaneously, and a defense built to hold a line, not fight in every direction at once, starts falling apart at the seams. Even that doesn't fully explain how 6 villages fell without Russian command reacting in time. The regiment's own statement revealed the detail that actually answers that question. According to Skelia's report, dedicated teams were systematically working to locate and eliminate Russian drone operators positioned behind the front line before and during the ground assault itself. That single detail carries more weight than almost anything else in this story. On a battlefield like this one, a drone operator sitting a kilometer or 2 behind the trenches isn't a minor supporting role. He's effectively the eyes of the entire defensive line, spotting assault groups in real time, calling in artillery, directing counterattacks toward whatever direction the danger is coming from. Remove that operator before the ground assault even reaches him, and something happens to even the most fortified position in the world. The trenches are still there, the mines are still buried. The weapons are still loaded and ready, but the soldiers inside can no longer see who's coming, from which direction, or how many of them there actually are. According to the regiment, the Russian forces defending this exact stretch of ground included the 120th Naval Infantry Division and units of the 68th Army Corps, the same elite division Russia had rushed south specifically to hold this territory. Skelia describes both formations as having suffered critical losses during the operation. That specific characterization comes directly from Ukraine's own military statement, and independent analysts haven't yet published a separate confirmed count, so it's worth treating as the claim of the unit that carried out the assault rather than a fully verified outside figure. At one location in particular, a village called Temerivka, The regiment reported destroying concentration points belonging to Russia's 656th Motorized Rifle Regiment. That detail reaches beyond the immediate battlefield, because an important Russian logistics route runs directly through that settlement, and Ukraine's advance means that corridor now sits within range of Ukrainian strike drones and artillery. Before this turns into a simple victory lap, it's worth being honest about what else was happening the same day. According to Ukrinform, as of 4 in the afternoon on July 13th, Russian forces had launched roughly 70 separate attacks against Ukrainian positions elsewhere along the front, with the heaviest pressure concentrated around Pokrovsk and Sloviansk. That context matters. This wasn't a quiet, isolated collapse in a corner of the war nobody else was watching. 6 villages fell in Dnipropetrovsk on a day when an entirely different battle was still raging just as hard along other parts of the same front line. So, a defensive collapse this fast against a stronghold Putin himself had staked his own public ambitions on doesn't happen by accident. And if you're finding value in these in-depth reports, make sure to subscribe. We dig beyond the headlines to bring you the context, evidence, and analysis that most coverage leaves out. Here's what makes this defeat sting even more for Moscow. This wasn't some quiet military objective buried in a classified folder somewhere in the Kremlin. Russia announced this plan to the entire world, out loud, with total confidence. Back in June of 2025, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov confirmed publicly that Russian forces pushing into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast were doing so specifically to build what he called a buffer zone.
Кроме того, хочу обратить ваше внимание на то, что, называя определенные направления, там, где создается буферная зона безопасности после вторжения в Курскую область.
That same week, a senior member of Russia's own parliament, Alexei Zhuravlev, went even further, calling openly for that buffer to stretch all the way to the Dnieper River, deep enough to push Ukrainian rocket systems permanently out of range of occupied Donetsk. And Russia's ambitions didn't stop at simply protecting territory it already held. According to a senior Ukrainian presidential official, Colonel Pavlo Polisa, Russia's actual documented goal was far bigger than a defensive shield. Moscow wanted to occupy the entire eastern bank of the Dnieper River by the end of 2026, swallowing all of eastern Dnipropetrovsk in the process. Notice the gap between those two stories. Publicly, Russia called this a buffer, a protective measure, something purely defensive. Privately, according to Ukraine's own government, the real goal was annexation, territory Russia intended to keep permanently, dressed up in the language of security. By the autumn of 2025, that ambition had real ground behind it. Russian forces expanded their footprint across the region to a peak of more than 400 square kilometers, according to Ukrainian military figures. That's not a token gain. That's a fully established occupation, complete with defensive positions, minefields, and a decorated division specifically assigned to hold it. Then Ukraine answered back. On the 29th of January, 2026, Ukraine's air assault forces launched a counteroffensive aimed squarely at unwinding everything Russia had built. By late February, Ukraine had reclaimed more territory than Russia managed to capture that same month, the first time that had happened anywhere on this front since the summer of 2023. The momentum kept building from there. By March 10th, Major General Oleksandr Komarenko, head of Ukraine's main operational directorate, confirmed publicly that Ukrainian forces had already reclaimed more than 400 square kilometers since the counteroffensive began. In his own words, almost the entire territory of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast had already been recaptured. Only 5 villages remained under Russian control at that point. Zaporizhzhia, Novohayarhivka, Sichnev, Maliivka, and one more. The exact same villages that fell on July 13th. Read that timeline carefully, because it tells you everything about how this ended. And here's the irony sitting right at the center of this entire strategy. Russia built this buffer specifically to protect its own supply corridors, the routes connecting its forces in Zaporizhzhia to its forces in Donetsk. That protection is exactly what's gone now. The shield Russia built to keep Ukrainian weapons at a distance has become the exact ground Ukrainian weapons now sit inside of. Even stranger, Russia's own military and media have barely acknowledged what actually happened. Russian Ministry of Defense briefings in the days following July 13th kept describing progress in Donetsk and Kharkiv, while staying almost completely silent on the Dnipropetrovsk collapse. One Russian military blogger even described the situation as Ukraine still trying to push Russian forces out and still trying to build a buffer zone of its own, days after Ukraine had already finished doing exactly that. That's not confusion, that's denial, playing out in public, about something that had already happened. A publicly declared strategy this ambitious just failed in full view of the entire world, with Ukraine's own general staff confirming the exact objective months before it was erased. But the regiment that actually delivered this defeat carries a story of its own, one this documentary can't responsibly skip past, and it's far more complicated than a simple story of battlefield heroism. The unit responsible for this operation is called the 425th Separate Assault Regiment, known by its call sign Skelia, which translates roughly to rock. This isn't a small formation. It's one of the largest assault regiments in the entire Ukrainian military, more than 10,000 personnel strong, built specifically as part of Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky's push to create dedicated, specialized assault units. Skelia doesn't answer to a regional corps commander the way most Ukrainian units do. It reports directly to Ukraine's top military command, and its combat record backs up that special status. This regiment has fought through some of the hardest, bloodiest sectors of the entire war, including Izium, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Pokrovsk. But celebrating this regiment's battlefield success without acknowledging what else is happening inside it would be dishonest. In June of 2026, a Ukrainian investigative outlet published findings alleging that at least 25 to 26 recruits within Skelia's own training centers had died between late 2025 and spring 2026. According to that investigation, some forensic examinations reportedly found injuries inconsistent with the causes of death officially recorded for those soldiers. Ukraine's own State Bureau of Investigation opened a criminal case just one day after that report was published, specifically examining possible abuse of power under martial law. The regiment's commanding officer was suspended from duty pending that investigation, and he is currently being treated as a suspect. This is a serious, ongoing legal matter, and it deserves to be treated as one rather than reduced to a shocking headline. The regiment itself has publicly disputed the full characterization of what happened. According to the unit's own statement, 18 of those 26 deaths occurred in hospital settings, and the regiment attributes them to underlying illness among newly mobilized soldiers rather than abuse. One suspect connected to the remaining cases is currently in custody, and the investigation is still active. Both of these things are true at the same time, and neither one cancels out the other. This is a regiment currently facing a serious criminal investigation into the deaths of its own recruits. It is also the same regiment that just executed one of the most disciplined, most tightly controlled offensive operations of the entire year, a simultaneous two-axis assault under total information blackout that left an elite Russian division reporting critical losses. That tension is worth sitting with, honestly, because it also explains something important. Given that Skelia is currently under this level of scrutiny, its own claims about enemy losses and battlefield outcomes deserve the same careful, cautious treatment independent analysts are already applying, verified where possible, clearly labeled as the regiment's own account where it isn't. But understanding exactly what Russia lost and why losing it hurts this much means looking closely at the specific formation that Moscow rushed south to defend this territory and what happened to it in less than 8 months. The Russian formation defending this ground wasn't some ordinary unit thrown together and rushed to the front. This was Russia's showpiece, a division built specifically to prove that Moscow could still expand its military machine even after 4 years of grinding losses. The 120th Naval Infantry Division was formally activated on the 22nd of December 2025 when Russia's Baltic Fleet redesignated its 336th Separate Guards Naval Infantry Brigade into a full division. This wasn't a fresh, untested unit built from nothing. The 336th Brigade carried battle honors dating back to the Second World War, including the title Belostok and decorations associated with some of the most storied names in Russian military history. When Russia turned that brigade into a division, it became the 9th new maneuver division Moscow had formed since the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022. That number matters more than it might seem at first. Building a new division isn't something a military does casually in the middle of an active war. It takes months of organizing, equipping, and training, and Russia had spent years working toward exactly this kind of expansion. The 336th Brigade's history before becoming a division reads like a tour through some of this war's bloodiest chapters. It fought in the assault on Mariupol, it fought in the Kherson region. It was observed operating along the Pokrovsk axis through the summer and autumn of 2025. This was a battle-tested, decorated formation, not a paper unit existing only on an organizational chart. In other words, Russia's newest, most symbolically important division was sent in as the fix for a problem that was already spiraling out of control. It didn't hold. According to the 425th Skelia Regiment's own statement, the 120th Division suffered what the regiment called critical losses during the July 13th operation, less than 8 months after the division was even formed. A unit built from decorated Second World War lineage, activated as proof that Russia could still grow its military, collapsed in under a year of actual combat. There's a deeper irony buried inside that timeline, too. According to Defense Express, sustained Ukrainian battlefield pressure had already delayed Russia's broader division formation program by close to 3 years. Ukraine slowed down Russia's ability to even build units like this one in the first place. Then, once Russia finally managed to stand this particular division up, Ukraine dismantled it within months of its first real deployment. The consequences of this collapse reach well beyond the 6 villages themselves. At a location called Dnipropetrovsk, Skelia's forces destroyed concentration points belonging to Russia's 656th Motorized Rifle Regiment. That location matters because an important Russian logistics corridor runs directly through it, the lateral route Russia uses to shift troops, ammunition, and equipment between its Zaporizhia front and its Donetsk front. With Ukrainian forces now holding this ground, that entire corridor sits inside range of Ukrainian artillery and strike drones. Every truck, every convoy, every resupply run moving along that route now travels through territory Ukraine can watch and strike at will. And this defeat is landing at possibly the worst possible moment for Russia's broader war effort. According to Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrsky, Russian forces are currently suffering more than 400 casualties for every square kilometer they manage to seize in the Donetsk region. Separately, intelligence assessments cited by ISW found that Russia had recruited only around 195,000 contract soldiers by early July, less than half of its own annual target of over 409,000. Replacing a division that just took critical losses isn't a simple matter of signing new paperwork when recruitment itself is already running dangerously far behind schedule. Even Russia's response after the defeat tells its own story. In the days following July 13th, Russian forces didn't attempt any serious counteroffensive to retake the 6 lost villages. Russian sources instead described nearby areas as unstable gray zones, language that points toward managing a collapsing perimeter, not planning a recovery. Now, step back and look at the full shape of what actually happened here, because the geometry of this defeat is almost too clean to be believed. Russia built this buffer zone with one specific purpose: push Ukrainian artillery and rocket systems far enough back that Russian supply corridors between the Zaporizhia and Donetsk fronts would sit safely out of range. That was the entire point. Protect the supply lines by controlling the ground around them. The July 13th operation flipped that logic completely inside out. Ukrainian forces now hold positions that place the Dnipropetrovsk corridor, the exact route Russia built this buffer to protect, well within striking range. Meanwhile, Ukrainian positions near Pokrovsk that Russian artillery once threatened have been pushed safely outside Russia's effective range instead. The shield didn't just fail, it reversed itself entirely. The thing Russia built to create safety became the reason its supply lines are now exposed. And here's what makes this defeat sting even harder once you zoom out far enough. This is not the first time Russia has tried building a buffer zone in this war, and it is not the first time that strategy has fallen apart. According to the Institute for the Study of War's own year-end assessment, Russia had already tried and failed to establish a lasting buffer zone in northern Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts throughout 2025. Russia also attempted something similar in Kursk Oblast, briefly pushing Ukrainian forces out by March of that year, but never managed to convert that success into a durable, lasting buffer. Add Dnipropetrovsk to that list now, fully erased as of July 13th. 4 separate attempts, 4 separate failures. That pattern isn't a coincidence, and it isn't bad luck either. Buffer zones require defending long, exposed stretches of territory that are expensive to hold, constantly need reinforcement, and leave flanks open to exactly the kind of concentrated counterattack Ukraine just delivered. Russia's industrial base and its recruitment pipeline simply can't sustain multiple buffer zone operations at once while also trying to press its main objectives elsewhere along the front. One Finnish military analyst, Emil Kastahelmi, offered a useful note of caution back in March, well before this operation was finished. According to him, the operation seems aimed at improving Ukraine's tactical position in the area. This is more of a local tactical operation than a large counteroffensive. Once they cleanse the remaining areas of Russian troops, they will likely try to solidify the line to the best of their abilities. That caution was fair at the time. But the completion of this operation on July 13th, an entire oblast cleared, a decorated division critically damaged, a publicly announced Russian strategy fully erased, has answered the exact question he was cautious about back in the spring. So here's the verdict worth landing on. Russia announced its ambitions in Dnipropetrovsk to the entire world, backed that ambition with a decorated division and 13 months of construction, and lost every square kilometer of it in roughly 5.5 months. The supply corridor that buffer zone was built to protect is now sitting inside Ukrainian fire range instead. Whatever comes next in this war, one thing is now painfully clear for Moscow. This is at least the 4th time Russia has tried building a buffer zone against Ukraine, and the 4th time that exact strategy has collapsed. The real question left standing isn't whether Russia can eventually rebuild what it just lost here. It's how many more times this same failed strategy has to fall apart before the Kremlin finally stops trying it. But there's something worth understanding before you draw your own conclusions about how much trouble Russia is actually in right now. Everything you just watched happen on land, the collapsed buffer zone, the critically damaged division, the exposed supply corridor, all of it connects directly to a campaign Ukraine had already been running somewhere else entirely, out on open water. Because before Dnipropetrovsk ever fell, Ukraine's drone fleet had already spent weeks tearing through Russia's shipping lanes in the Sea of Azov, and once that water route was choked off, Ukraine didn't stop there. It pushed further out, into the Black Sea itself, and started hitting targets most analysts assumed were still out of reach. We covered exactly how that campaign unfolded. 20 Russian ships hit, a supply network built over years unraveling in a matter of weeks, and why that maritime pressure is the other half of the story behind everything Russia is losing on land right now. If you want the full picture of how deep this goes, that video is on your screen right now, and it's genuinely worth watching before you decide how close Russia actually is to running out of options. This is the Frontline show, bringing you the developments shaping this war as they happen. We'll see you in the next one.